The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Syndicate Network from SupChina. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, the senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good morning to you, Cobus.
Good morning.
Cobus, today we're going to be touching on one of the most sensitive geopolitical issues in the China-Africa relationship, and it involves the tiny little kingdom of eSwatini and Taiwan. Now, the reason why this is so sensitive is because when any issue comes to us related to Taiwan, it is one of the red line issues that the Chinese take very, very seriously. And Cobus, it came up really early in this year because the Chinese embassy in Pretoria issued a statement related to eSwatini, and that really set off a lot of alarm bells. Tell us a little bit about first eSwatini and then a little bit about the statement.
So eSwatini is an independent country surrounded completely by South Africa, and it's an independent state. It predates the Republic of South Africa's existence, and it is ruled by a king, King Swati, and Eswatini is the last remaining country in Africa to have formal diplomatic relationships with relations with Taiwan. So everything that happens in Eswatini essentially runs through the monarchy. The king has very high levels of control in the country, and since the statement came out, we've seen the case of Eswatini being used among others in the right-wing press in the US as this incident of a small country kind of being bossed around by China, which obviously it is a small country and China is a very big country. But we should also keep in mind that Eswatini has its own specific human rights issues. The monarchy is an absolute monarchy. There's a lot of criticism of the way that the monarchy rules. In Eswatini, the king himself is personally very rich. And the people of Eswatini are very poor, with some of the highest HIV infection rates in the world. So there's a lot of issues to raise about Eswatini outside of the China relationship, but the China relationship kind of suddenly cast it into this kind of high contrast in international geopolitical terms, where suddenly it's all about China and America and the relationship between China and Africa, and the quest for China to try and kind of push Taiwan out of Africa completely. So Eric, maybe before we go ahead, you should introduce what the China-Taiwan relationship is really about for people who are newcomers to this issue.
A lot of people outside of the China-Taiwan kind of sphere don't really understand the distinction between China and Taiwan. And particularly in Africa, I run into this quite a bit. So before we delve into our discussion about eSwatini, let me just walk through some of the basics about Taiwan. And it is very, very important to note that this is highly contentious. This is an unsettled historical issue. So up until 1971, Taiwan was recognized by the United Nations, and that really is a result of the 1949 Civil War with China, where China and Taiwan split, and China considers Taiwan to be a renegade province. Then Resolution 2578 was passed in 1971, and that switched UN recognition from Taiwan to China and really became the opening of what's called the One China policy. And that's something that's been a core tenet of Chinese foreign policy since then, to ensure that everybody recognizes China as the sole legitimate power for China, and that Taiwan itself is a renegade outlying province. Now, this is something that is not accepted at all in Taiwan, to be fair, but it really became a major international issue back in 1979 when the U.S. then switched its diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing. And since 1979, China has done its very best to persuade, to force, to cajole, to whatever you want to call it, basically all other countries who recognize Taiwan to abandon their relationship with Taipei in favor of Beijing. Only a few decades ago, Cobus, it was interesting because Taiwan had a lot of diplomatic relations, including with your own country, South Africa. That was really just less than 25 years ago. And today, basically 15 countries remain recognizing Taiwan. They're mostly the smallest, poorest countries in the world. We're talking about the Marshall Islands, Palau, Tuvalu, the Vatican. So it really is, in many ways, these are the sunset of Taiwan's diplomatic relations because the Chinese, like what they're doing in eSwatini, are putting on an enormous amount of pressure. So with all that said, I think we tried to set up the eSwatini-Taiwan issue because we want to get to our guests very, as soon as possible. But the idea here is that this is a very, very complicated issue with historical ties that run very, very deep. And so this all kind of popped up on everybody's radar in January when there was an article that came out in the South African newspaper, the Daily Maverick, China Turns the Screws on eSwatini. It was written by freelance journalist Karine Duplessis, who is based in Johannesburg and joins us on the line for the first time on the show. Welcome. Very great to have you.
It's great to be on the show. Good morning.
And then we're also thrilled to have on the program for the very first time going to eSwatini, or formerly known as Swaziland, Becky Makubu, who is the editor of The Nation magazine. Thank you very much for taking the time this morning, Becky.
Thank you for having me here.
So, Karine, let me start with you, because your article in many ways was triggered by this statement issued from the Chinese embassy in Pretoria. And let me just read a little bit about the statement so people can get a gist of it. This was published on February 1. It said, "No diplomatic relations, no business benefits." And there is only one China, the statement says, in the world, and the government of the People's Republic of China is the sole legitimate government representing the whole of China, including Taiwan. Taiwan is an integral part of China. This is the one China principle or policy. And it goes on to say, it is very hard for the friendly African countries of China to attend any AU summit hosted by a country refusing to recognize one China principle, that's their grammar, and maintaining so-called diplomatic ties with Taiwan. So there's a veiled threat in there coming out of the embassy. There was also some logistical issues that they said that people in eSwatini now must go to Pretoria to apply for visas. Tell us a little bit about the background that prompted you to write your story and what the issues are.
Yeah, well, Eric, to be frank, this story, I actually got this press release from Becky first, and then all the other opposition guys sent the press release. It was doing the rounds on social media, on WhatsApp in eSwatini. And it was issued by your favorite ambassador, Lin Songtian. I heard you speaking a lot about him and his diplomatic efforts. And yeah, he issued this strongly worded statement. I think the background to it is Becky would be able to tell us more about what's happened on his side, because I think he was sort of on the front line of the push, the diplomatic push last year. But basically, I think that China's trying to put the screws on eSwatini. They've been trying to get it through the king. They've been wooing MPs. MPs have been going to China on study trips. And this, I got the sense, was very much aimed at the business community, at putting the screws on the business community, because I know on this side, the business community is trying very hard to get a positive PR for eSwatini, especially to the outside world. I've had some old PR friend contacting me and saying, we're helping out with the PR, and it comes from the business side. They want eSwatini to look better to the outside because they want more business, because the economy hasn't been doing well. So I think that's kind of the background to it, that China realized if it wants to push into eSwatini, it should turn the screws on all the sectors in eSwatini. But then also, I guess, and Becky might be able to talk more about this, because he's taught me a lot about what I know about the China-Eswatini relationship. So maybe I'll leave it to him to talk about the sort of push last year, that his interview with the ambassador.
So, Becky, is this an unprecedented statement, or have you been seeing pressure from China ratcheting up over time on Eswatini?
Well, it started last year, towards the end of last year, when suddenly it appeared in the media that some MPs had gone to China and that they were on the take with China. That was the spin given to it. And I got a call from the embassy saying they'd like to talk to me to have an interview in Pretoria. And I went there. And the ambassador, Song Tian, told me what exactly they want and what's going on. He said that they'd been trying to talk to the king to make a case for why Swaziland should move, or Eswatini should move to China and cut diplomatic ties with Taiwan. But they had been unsuccessful in getting an appointment with him. So he said that what they were now doing is they were now taking the whole thing to the Swazi public. They want the people of Eswatini to know that they've reached the end of their patience with Swaziland and that they're going to start taking action because they don't understand why our country continues to recognize Taiwan when the rest of the world now recognizes China. I asked him, obviously, why do you care about what Swaziland thinks, seeing as we're so small a country? And he said, well, the reason is twofold. One, because the principle of non-recognition of Taiwan is important to them. And two, because we were strategically positioned. By the way, Swaziland is not completely surrounded by South Africa, and this is important on how the Chinese see it. There's Mozambique to the east. So you've got 3/4 of the country surrounded by South Africa, and one side there's Mozambique. And they want easy access to the sea, both in Durban, South Africa, and Maputo, Mozambique. And Swaziland is convenient as a way to get there when they do business in South Africa, for instance. So they're a bit frustrated by the non-availability of that option. And they are saying, in fact, he said to me, of the small countries that still recognize Taiwan, Swaziland was the most important for them in terms of how they want to do business in Africa. So you could say we are the biggest among the smallest. And but before they do anything, he said that he wants the people of Eswatini to know that they have been trying and now they are going to put the screws on just to make the point until we give in.
Well, I can see the optics for why this is important for Ambassador Lin and the Chinese government, because they want to be able to say, we have the entire African continent now that recognizes China and does not recognize Taiwan. And you are the last holdout. So it doesn't really matter the size. It could be Nigeria being the last holdout. That would still be something that frustrates them, because they want to put a bow on this and say all of Africa recognizes China. But I guess the question, here's the straight up question, because last year or the year before, I forget, Principe and Sao Tome were tiny little islands off, geopolitically not important, but they switched their diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing. And basically the dominoes seem to be falling. And so the question for you and the king is why is the king so adamant about holding on to relations with Taipei? Why not just accept the money, accept the, all the attribution that goes and the recognition and all the, the payday that will probably come if you switch your recognition to China?
Well, let me answer you this way. Since around, let's say around 2010, maybe a little before, when China exploded into the scene, in the world scene, as a powerhouse. I remember talking to some people here at Swatini, and they said even then that, look, we can't avoid the Chinese. They will eventually get here, and we will have to do something because a lot of things come from China. Our banking system, our internet system, the cell phones, they said we can't avoid it. That was then. What is strange now, even for me, is with what the Chinese are doing, we are still, for many reasons, I'm sure that are obvious, given what the guy said in the opening, we're not having a conversation in Swaziland about China. You know, the media in Swaziland has been reluctant to engage on this issue because it is felt that the king holds strong views on the matter, that we should stick to Taiwan. And the Taiwanese are very sensitive to anything that, any discussion on the matter. And so it's sort of, we are just not talking about it. I'm the only media house, the one I work for, that has really taken up this issue to the public. And so many accusations have been made against me. But we are not, so it's very difficult to know why we are not even talking about it. The government, we have tried to speak to a few cabinet ministers about it. There is one thing that seems to be clear is that this thing will have to happen sooner or later. It doesn't matter who you talk to, but why the king is not buying into this, why nobody is talking to him about it and, saying, look, we can't do anything. I mean, I spoke to an MD of a bank and he was saying they are upgrading their systems right now in line with international norms. And most of the software and equipment they're getting is coming from China. So if China stops trading with Swaziland, there's going to be a problem with our banking system, which will put us in trouble with the international community in how money moves. So it's a problem that is there that we all see, but nobody wants to talk about it because nobody wants to offend the king. Now, the Chinese have got a view on why the king doesn't want to engage with them, but which among us here, everybody talks about. I mean, since the Chinese problem started, people are talking about it more and more. That, look, we know why the king doesn't want to listen to China and wants to stick with Taiwan. But we're just sort of, I think I would say, we are saying, look, if the king thinks it's in the best interest of the country to ignore China, then he will know what's best for us, and he will know how to get out of the mess that we might find ourselves in going forward.
Karine, in your article, you mentioned that eSwatini was hoping to host an upcoming AU summit. And as I understand, one of the reasons why China is pushing so hard to get Taiwan out of eSwatini is also, it does relate to how it interacts with the AU, because if there are still states that don't have diplomatic relationships with China, then it compromises, the AU, like dealing with the AU as a decision-making body for China. Can you unpack the AU connection in all of this?
Yes, the AU connection has been puzzling me since last year. I'm a regular reporter from AU summits. I go to the AU summit in Addis Ababa every year in January, February. And last year, we heard the story from officials, South African officials, that eSwatini is supposed to host the mid-year summit this year. It's it rotates from country to country and from region to region. And then we heard, but eSwatini couldn't afford to. There's been an article about this big convention center that eSwatini's been building since, I can't remember the exact year, but I think 2-3 years ago, they started building this big convention center with the view of hosting this summit and being able to accommodate all these, all these heads of state. And suddenly it's kind of been stopping, and it's been running over costs, and it's been becoming unaffordable, and there's been some funding issues. I'm not clear what that all is. And then sort of towards the end of last year and beginning of this year, I heard that no, the summit's not going to be hosted in eSwatini anymore. It might go, I don't know, I think to Chad or somebody else. It was open to negotiation. And this whole thing was supposed to coincide with eSwatini chairing the AU, but for some reason it was decided that South Africa should chair the AU because they've got more, I think, capability, more money. I'm not sure exactly what the reasons was behind that. So South Africa's chairing the AU this year, and the summit's not being hosted in eSwatini. And then one of the things when I looked into this convention center issue was that Taiwan was behind giving some of the funds to the convention center. And I've been trying to ask ministers or spokespeople from eSwatini what's happening with this convention centre. And suddenly everybody's denying that it was ever meant to be for the AU summit. It's just meant to be a big convention centre to attract tourism to eSwatini. I spoke to the tourism minister last year at Meetings Africa 2020, last week at Meetings Africa 2020, and I asked him this question. And he was very sort of evasive. He didn't really answer the question. So I think there are big issues that China wants to put some pressure on South Africa, perhaps, to, as chair of the AU, to put pressure on Eswatini or to kind of treat them as outcasts in the AU because they're the only AU country that doesn't have relations with China. So I think that this statement that came out at the end of last year was perhaps also aimed at South African leaders, at President Cyril Ramaphosa. And I've been told that Ramaphosa, that the Chinese have asked Ramaphosa to put some pressure on the king himself, and apparently has tried, but obviously so far he hasn't had any luck yet. But it didn't stop. Yeah, and I just want to add, it didn't stop Eswatini from attending the AU summit this year. I was there in Addis Ababa, and the king himself wasn't there, but some officials were there, and they were dressed up in traditional clothes, and everybody was taking selfies with him. So Eswatini's been quite defiant. Their posture's been quite defiant at the AU.
It's interesting, Karine, because you're talking about the geopolitics of it, and when your article came out, several people who I know inside the U.S. government at quite senior levels sent me your article unprompted separately and said, this is something that's on their radar. And it's interesting because even though eSwatini is a tiny little place, geopolitically insignificant in the broader scheme of things, it is very representative of the broader struggle between China and Taiwan, the U.S., and all this others. And let me just give you a quote from Josh Meservey, who's an influential scholar at the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank in Washington. He covers Africa and Middle East policy there. And he tweeted, soon after your article came out, one of the world's largest and most powerful countries, hashtag China, is bullying one of the smallest and least powerful, hashtag eSwatini. Beijing is closing all routes to a visa except for a South African embassy because eSwatini exercises its sovereign right to recognize Taiwan. Now, this is really interesting because the feedback that I got from U.S. government officials and that tweet from Josh indicate that I can see the United States really getting in there and trying to protect eSwatini from switching sides. Now, remember, Donald Trump got very, very angry at El Salvador and Middle East and Central American countries for considering, and El Salvador actually did switch its recognition. And he got really, really angry. And so this is an issue that is resonating in Washington. And I guess, Becky, my question to you is, there is a U.S. embassy in eSwatini. Do they have anything to say on this issue? Have you heard from them either informally, or is the U.S. embassy making any statements on this as to what they think the king should do?
No, they haven't said anything publicly, and informally I haven't spoken to anyone to find out what their position is. But I do know that among officials in Swaziland, there is that belief that, well, America's on our side, so we're going to be okay. Remember this, America the U.S. has a new embassy in Eswatini. Apparently, it was one of the highest security areas that has. It's strategic for the U.S. in the Southern African region. It is high security. I've never been in it, but when it was built, it was said that it's something else. That you won't find anything like this in Africa. That's what they said. So I guess. For their interests, this whole they have a big interest in the matter, but no, they haven't said anything officially, or I haven't spoken to the officials there because I do talk to them sometimes, and I haven't engaged them on this matter at all, unfortunately yet.
Becky, what was the reaction inside of Eswatini to this statement coming from the Chinese embassy?
The government, first of all. sort of didn't believe that the statement was coming from the Chinese. They said it was undiplomatic language that they used. And apparently they tried to verify it with the embassy, and the embassy confirmed it. But having done so, they then sort of went into a shutdown because nothing has happened since then. I do remember, but I'm told that it was for different reasons. The media ignored the statement. There was nothing that was written in the newspapers about it. But I'm now told that the reason why that happened was because at the same time the king was opening parliament, and they didn't want the Chinese thing to drown the king's speech. So, because it was more sensational what the Chinese had said. So they said to the media, don't touch that statement until we tell you. And that's what happened. That's why it sort of stayed in social media. We ran with it, but that was way after all the events. So it's a matter that's been subdued really in Swaziland, this matter of the Chinese, as I said earlier. And one of the arguments put forward, by the way, has been that we've been friends with Taiwan for since 1968 when we gained independence, and we are not going to abandon our friends at their hour of need. So we're holding out.
That's a bold statement. That's really bold. Karine, let's put the question about reaction to you. What kind of response did you get in South Africa for your story? And did you hear from the embassy by any chance?
I did get in touch with the Chinese embassy to ask them if the statement is real, because it caught me by surprise actually, and Becky's been, I think, at the receiving end of worse tweets, but there was a big backlash on Twitter, and there were tweets calling me. It said it's fake news, and they're saying, "What do you expect from a journalist?"
Who was calling you that? Was it the embassy calling you that, or was it trolls, just online trolls?
No, it was trolls. I think it was trolls from eSwatini, or I'm not sure where they come from, but it's eSwatini sort of seemed like they're based there, or at least they come from that perspective. And they said I was publishing fake news, and what can you expect from? They were trying to discredit me, saying I'm the kind of journalist who would fall for anything. So I was really surprised at that backlash. I mean, in South Africa, it's not a big deal. In South Africa, we have a free media. We can say what we like. The reporting, I think our journalism ethics, it's a bit different than eSwatini, because we report what we like. We criticize the government. We're not as deferential, perhaps, as the newspapers there. I'm making an exception of Becky, because I think he's been quite... He's gotten into trouble for his reporting in eSwatini before, because he doesn't care. He reports what he likes. So yeah, but in South Africa, there's not been that much of a reaction. I've been trying to probe South African officials about this eSwatini thing, and they're saying, oh, it's not a big deal. This eSwatini China thing, they're not really talking about it that much. So it's not really on their radar. But, I mean, South Africa is very close to China. So I guess perhaps behind the scenes, we don't want to be seen to be a big bully and bully eSwatini into who their friends should be. But on the other side, we would want to please China because we consider China to be a fraternal country, to quote some government officials. So yeah, but I'm quite surprised about the US reaction that you were talking about, because I didn't pick it up here. But then again, I didn't ask. I didn't expect them to have a big reaction.
Yeah, because Taiwan, sorry to interrupt you, Taiwan is very important to the Trump administration, and much more important than it was, say, under the Obama administration. Remember that one of the first phone calls that Donald Trump made as president was to Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen, breaking decades of precedent that the U.S. president does not take a side in the China-Taiwan issue. Now, with the trade tensions between the U.S. and China and the security tensions, this idea that Josh Meservey brought up in his tweet, which was this big bully of a communist country picking on a tiny little innocent kingdom, one of the smallest, really resonates, I think, in Washington. And there's a lot of appetite in Washington to challenge China and to protect what it sees as a vulnerable country from aggressiveness from China. I mean, that's just channeling what I think what people in Washington would say. On Twitter, did you get any reaction, or from outside of, just generally speaking, to your article?
Generally speaking, the trolls were the biggest. It was the biggest reaction that I got. I mean, people were speaking about it, and they said it's an interesting article. And I think this David and Goliath narrative really captures the imagination. So in that sense, yes, I think people, there's often a very negative perception towards China on the African continent. So they're kind of, rooting for eSwatini, saying, good for the small guy to keep out against this big bully. So that's the kind of reaction. But I think in real terms, in terms of economic progress and in terms of just having relations with the rest of the world, China would be important to eSwatini. Also because of its proximity to South Africa and the connections here, the networks here.
Becky, for people who don't know eSwatini politics, can you give us a little bit of an idea of what the role of and the powers of the king is in relation to the parliament? Does the decision to go with China or Taiwan, who does it really come down to?
Okay, I think as you said earlier, the king is an absolute monarch. It means just that. He runs the country alone, exclusive to everybody. What he says goes. And when he says we go with Taiwan, it goes with Taiwan regardless of anything that we might say. If Parliament has been shut down, they've been banned from discussing the issue. The MPs who went to China did try to raise the issue in Parliament, and they were told that it's not open for discussion, and it was left at that. So it's the king that decides what's going to happen, and the challenge is for the right people to go and have a sit down with the king and talk to him and convince him that maybe China is the right way, or if they agree with him, to tell China to go away. But in the end, it all depends on what he says, and what he says goes.
It seems that 2020 is going to be a year that this really becomes an issue because, I mean, the statement from Ambassador Lin Songtian was not subtle at all. So before we go, because I know both of you have a very busy day ahead of you, I'd like to get your thoughts about where does this go next? What's going to happen? I mean, I don't think Ambassador Lin issues a statement like this and then just says, okay, that's it. We're going to let this sit for a while. Karine, let's first go to you, and then Becky, to you. What do you see as next? Karine?
Well, I think this whole push has been rudely interrupted by the coronavirus epidemic and the crisis around that. And most press conferences we have seen in the past few weeks at the Chinese embassy have been either about this or about America and the trade war. So I think it might have been interrupted by that, and also perhaps China might have lost a bit of steam after the elections in Taiwan that went towards the pro-Taiwan side or the anti-China side. So, but I think they will continue to push, and I think once the coronavirus outbreak, once that's under control, we will perhaps continue to see Ambassador Lin making strong statements about eSwatini, and I guess continue to lobby and perhaps push the business community more. And I think Becky could talk towards what will happen inside eSwatini between the business community and the king and how influential they would be. But I don't think this will go away soon.
I think Karine is right about the coronavirus sort of killing the steam in a way. But one thing that is problematic, I think, in Swaziland is the fact that everybody you speak to that understands how the world works says we have to go to China. It makes sense for eSwatini. There's consensus, and I'm talking from corporate leaders to politicians, even some cabinet ministers will tell you that China is the answer to our problems. Maybe I should tell you what Ambassador Songtian said to me. He, particularly in relation to the American question, he said to me, first of all, Swaziland, Europe and America don't have money, at least not the kind that they have. So he said, they won't help you. in what is going to happen, because that's why Africa is suffering now, because those two areas have run out of money to help Africa. And he said, we are the only people who can help Africa financially and get people out of their mess. And he said, when it comes to Taiwan, he said, and we spoke here before the elections, and he said, look, we have a party we want to see win that will give us back our country. But in the event that they lose, which is what happened, he said, we will take Taiwan by any means necessary. What is important is Swaziland must ask itself where it will stand when we do. That is the Chinese. They said there's no question that they will take Taiwan at some point. He said it's inevitable. But here, Eswatini, there seems to be consensus, at least among the people whose views should matter, that China makes sense to us at many levels. In fact, it's been said that China is our biggest trading partner after South Africa. But the Taiwanese have come out to say that's not true. But we do know that things like the coaches for our railways come from China. We know that most of the equipment for our electricity provider comes from China. If China were to stop us from getting equipment for telecommunications and electricity, we would be in trouble. But I doubt that it will get to that. I really doubt it. I think eventually we'll come round to what is right for us. And depending on who our friends are, I think even the king will eventually see what the options are. It's just that right now, what is slowing us down besides the coronavirus issue is the fact that among ourselves in Swaziland, we are not discussing this issue. And from what I'm told, nobody seems to be ready yet to go and face the king and say, Your Majesty, let's debate this issue and look at what's in it for the country. Nobody seems to have had the courage to do that yet.
Well, it may not be on the king's mind, but it is definitely on the Chinese mind, and it will not go away anytime soon. So I think to Karin's point, they're going to force the point to make the king make this a priority for the king. And it seems like they have a lot of levers they can pull to squeeze eSwatini.
I just wanted to say that Song Tian said to me that about that convention center you were referring to. He said, we are aware of this convention center that you're building. And he said, nobody's going to come, no friend of ours is going to come to your country and hold a meeting. He was clear about that. He said, so long as the African countries expected in your country are our friends, they are not coming unless you are our friends too. So, but we still continue to build the convention center.
Man, that is hardball politics right there. I mean, man, wow. I mean, it's like there's nothing subtle. We are in the Trump era of global politics now. I mean, that's what makes Lin Songtian so interesting. I mean, you wouldn't get that from a lot of other Chinese politicians. They would give you kind of abstract ideas, tea leaves to be read, and, be very indirect. And this guy, man, he just hits you right in the chest.
He spoke to me for 3 hours.
Well, there we go. I mean,
yeah.
Yeah, we know all about it this side.
Wow, that's incredible. That is really amazing. If we ever get Lin Songtian on our show, which I highly doubt that will ever happen, it will be the longest podcast in history.
Oh yeah, and you won't be allowed to ask a question because he'll answer your questions before you ask them. he just talks. He keeps.
Yeah, I've been in that same position. Yes.
Well, listen, I want to thank both of you for taking time out of your day. Before we go, a lot of our folks are going to be interested in following what you're doing. Karin, you are a superstar on Twitter. What is the best? What is your Twitter name so that people can join the hundreds of thousands who follow you?
My Twitter handle is just my name and my surname, Karin du Plessis, CarinDupLessis.
No joke. She's got 102,000 followers. So there's a lot going on Karin's Twitter handle and Twitter feed. So we really encourage people to follow what she's reading and writing these days. And Becky, you are a great source for all news Swaziland. I've been following you. Where can people find you?
At Bheki Makhubu, which is BhekiMakhubu. That's my Twitter handle.
I will put a link to both of Karine and Becky's Twitter handles in the show notes. Want to thank you both for taking the time to talk about this very important issue. And we look forward to coming back to you in a few months when there is an update, because something tells me there's going to be an update on this. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for asking us. Thank you, Eric.
Okay, thanks for having us.
Cobus, as we were listening to Becky kind of recount how Lin Songtian was talking to him about Taiwan and the terms, that directness and the passion and the emotion that no doubt, if I was in that room, I could see that would probably be an issue that, this is an ambassador who talks a lot and gets easily kind of revved up. But I think on the Taiwan issue, he is probably amped up even more. And it brought me back to my graduate school days. I did my graduate program at the University of Hong Kong on Chinese foreign policy. And we did a semester up in Beijing at Beijing University, one of the most prestigious universities in all of China. And I asked my professor, we were doing a Chinese foreign policy class, and after class, I asked my professor, I said, why does Taiwan matter so much? And he's a mainland Chinese professor. And he said, to us, this was 20 years ago, he said, to us, Taiwan is our Jerusalem. And I said, would you really throw away everything that China has built up? I mean, incredible to become the world's second largest economy, and throw it all the way in the name of 22 million people. And he explained something to me that really shaped my thinking on it, and I think really also articulates why people like Ambassador Lin and all Chinese take this issue so seriously. He said, over the history of Chinese history for thousands of years, the country has expanded and contracted. And when the country was weak, the borders fell apart and the emperor fell. And when the country was strong, the borders were strong and the emperor was strong. So the idea of Taiwan breaking away and declaring independence would be the ultimate repudiation of the emperor, or today, the president. And he would lose all credibility, the Communist Party would lose all credibility, and the government would fall. This is one of the only issues in China that I've seen that really unites the entire country, from the peasant all the way up to the president and the prime minister. I mean, there is no deviation on this that I've ever met in 25, 30 years of being in China. Everybody in China believes that Taiwan is an inseparable part of China. And it's just as we heard with Becky, it's only a matter of time that it comes back into the fold. Deng Xiaoping had a famous line that said, we can wait 99 years. Xi Jinping, interestingly enough, said, we will not wait 99 years. We don't have the patience for that anymore. So Xi Jinping, like Donald Trump, is injecting a sense of urgency into foreign policy that we haven't seen before. And in some ways, I think the tone that we heard from Ambassador Lin reflects what President Xi has been saying on that front as well, that impatience is growing. And so these are really complex issues. I think, too, Cobus, that this is going to be brought into a broader U.S. issue as well, that the United States is watching this closely, because I don't think they give a hoot about eSwatini. But I do think that they look at this as a David and Goliath issue. They look at this idea of what Josh Meservey was saying of a big bullying communist country against a sovereign, tiny little kingdom. They don't like that. So this is going to be one of the interesting stories of 2020.
As you say, it fits into a very strong, very powerful political mythology in China, and it also fits, or it's insertable easily. You can easily slot it into a David and Goliath narrative in the US. It's very easy to turn eSwatini into the kind of freedom fighters of the Star Wars of the Star Wars franchise. Up against the Death Star. It's easy to do that in US mythological terms. But the only way that you can do that is by completely disregarding what's going on in eSwatini itself, which is dire in lots of ways. Like, eSwatini is it's an absolute monarchy. The king is rich. The king is like several Rolls Royces in his garage rich. And the people in the Eswatini are dirt poor. And the country, in a lot of ways, like journalists that I know who went there, South African journalists who went to Eswatini to report, have had their phones tapped. It is essentially a kind of an absolutely controlled, centrally controlled police state. So there's no way to put Eswatini into this kind of little scrappy fighter for democracy against China narrative unless you completely ignore what's actually going on in Eswatini. And I think for that reason, it makes me concerned, kind of that it is kind of being weaponized in this kind of way. What I would rather see is actual engagement with the situation in Eswatini, which in lots of cases, as we mentioned, some of the highest per capita HIV infections in the world, with some of the lowest, kind of care being implemented. So for that reason alone, I think it's important to engage with the actual people of Eswatini rather than with these kind of big political narratives.
Did you hear what Becky said at the beginning of the discussion, that they called in the media in eSwatini because the embassy couldn't get an appointment with the king?
Yes. That's revealing.
That's what we call in the US the Hollywood no, which is just basically to clear the calls and not take the phone call. And you got to think that just infuriates a guy like Ambassador Lin Songtian. Just infuriates him that you're not even willing to have the conversation. There's nothing to be said. And so in so many ways, that statement, and I encourage everybody to read it. We'll put a link in our show notes. It's impolitic. It's direct. I think it's reflective of the language of our times in politics now, that we're seeing a lot of this come out of the US and Europe and populist governments. We're not really accustomed to seeing it come out of the Chinese government that much, but boy, it sounds like an extended Lin Songtian tweet, to be honest with you. There's grammatical errors in it, but it's direct, and he's really, he's got hidden threats in there about the AU summit, issue in there. It doesn't seem like there was a lot of thought and strategy, and it was mulled over by the foreign ministry in Beijing and went back and forth, and the English was polished. No, it doesn't seem like that. It almost feels like, Ambassador Lin said, take a memo, and he just dictated it out. That's what it seems like. But in so many ways, it's a marker now. It's officially a marker. So he's kind of laid out his terms that we're not going to budge. This is important to us. You're on our radar. We can make your life difficult in so many ways. Cutting off financing, cutting off the technology, cutting off the trains. That's just the above board stuff. There's below board stuff that can happen as well to make life difficult. And the way that it seemed like they were talking, was he was making it pretty clear. We can mess with you, and we will if you force us into that position.
And, the thing is, we know that they can do this, right? And if we know that China can put a lot of pressure on Eswatini, and that China is a key partner, key trade partner, key development partner to all of the countries in this region. We also know that despite US and European rhetoric, it's not like the US is going to fly in, like on angel wings to come and provide cell phone service in Eswatini in case the Chinese cut it off. This is mostly a rhetorical stance coming out of Washington. It's not going to be backed up by real, kind of concrete help.
It'll be rhetoric. It'll just be another talking point that the U.S. uses to bash China in Africa.
Yes.
It'll just be on a list of many talking points, probably. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So, so for that reason, I think the decision is going to come down to very kind of real African kind of calculations about what they can get from where, and that in the end, I think will probably kind of force the decision.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, though, this is up to one guy. It's up to the king. And Becky was interesting, as he said, we just don't know what the king is thinking. He hasn't really articulated or explained himself because kings generally don't feel any obligation to explain themselves. So it could be one of those things where he says, you know what, I'll take my 6 Rolls Royces and I'll let my country go down the tubes, even if China wants to strangle us. Or he can say, he can wake up one morning and go, you know what, Taiwan, it's been nice, but this $1 billion check that's coming from Taiwan, because that's what in Sao Tome and Principe, that's what they did. There basically was a giant check waiting for them. It says, if you switch, we will then guarantee development money, infrastructure investment, trade, and whatnot. I'm not sure it's lived up to the expectations, but some of it was there. And probably my guess is people were well taken care of along the way. Just a suspicion not backed up by any evidence. So this is, you cannot overstate the importance of this issue to the Chinese. Impossible. There are few issues more important than Taiwan to the Chinese, and a guy like Lin Songtian is a dog on a bone, and that's a complimentary thing. He's going to just keep going on it. He's not gonna go away. So this is definitely an issue that will be very, very interesting to follow. This is the kind of stuff that we've been writing quite a bit in our newsletter every day. These are not the issues that make it onto the New York Times or into the Washington Post, into the mainstream coverage of China-Africa relations. But if you are following China-Africa relations, either Chinese foreign policy or African foreign policy, this is going to be a very important topic. And that's why I really urge you to subscribe to our daily newsletter. You can go to ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe. Cobus and I are putting it together every single day. It's $149 for a year, $75 a year for students and academics. It's not a lot of money for what you're getting. And it really is, we're providing, somebody said it's like a daily intelligence brief on China-Africa. And that's really what it is, with insight, analysis, exclusive content that you just won't find anywhere else. Again, ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe. Try it out for 2 weeks. If you don't like it, you can cancel at any time. But just a note that this is the same newsletter now that's being read by top journalists in Africa, senior officials in the State Department, senior officials in the Chinese government, the folks at some of the Chinese embassies in Africa are all reading it. So if you want to get a sense of what these folks are reading every day, then subscribe to our newsletter. We're very proud that we have such a very diverse and influential group of readers. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. For Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadinsky or Eric at eOlander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.